Okay, so to get started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jason Beringer. Jason is a professor in the School of Agriculture and Environment at the University of Western Australia. Jason is broadly interested in ecosystem services and how they will respond to climate change and future disturbance. He has conducted extensive research in Australia's dryland ecosystems, considering interactions among fire, precipitation, and ecosystem production. And as founding member and current director of TURN OzFlux, he has overseen the growth of the network and co-hosted the recent 20th anniversary OzFlux meeting. So you're already sharing your screen, Jason, so thank you. The title of Jason's talk today is OzFlux, From Little Things, Big Things Grow. So take it away, Jason.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to everyone this morning, and a very good day to you, whatever time zone you're in. Hope you're having a really terrific day. So I'm presenting today a little bit about the history, where we're currently at, and challenges and opportunities for the OzFlux network. And I'm doing that on behalf of myself and Helen Clue, in particular from CSIRO, and of course the whole OzFlux community has made this possible to get to the point where we are in terms of the development of the network. Before I go any further, I need to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands across Australia upon which we work, and in our case, that's the Noongar people. And we pay their respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection with land, water and culture. So in terms of the OzFlux network, with this audience, I don't need to tell you of the great importance of the interactions between the land surface and the atmosphere in terms of the biophysical and biogeochemical cycles, how that is influenced by climate and climate change, and how that can then feed back to affect climate. And so with that in mind, we set out to create a monitoring network of flux towers around Australia, which we now call OzFlux. And in the diagram to the right is an image from the Biogeosciences introduction to the OzFlux network, which was a joint paper in 2016. So I commend you to that for more details on the network. And what we've done is try to create a national research facility for assessing trends in ecosystem fluxes, and to try and improve the predictions of the terrestrial biosphere and the climate for Australia, and contribute to an overarching global network of flux towers, of course, which you know as FLUXNET. So we're one of the regional flux networks within that. So the OzFlux network as a whole aims to measure over a range of different ecosystem types or key biomes, and also across a large range of climatic space, including much of semi-arid regions. Our overarching science questions, one's sort of around ecosystem productivity. What are the drivers of ecosystem productivity, and therefore carbon sinks and greenhouse gas emissions over time and space? How resilient are ecosystems and ecosystem fluxes to a variable and changing climate, including disturbance? And you would know recently in Australia we had large fires in February, as well as having a very dry and hot continent. Another question around the water fluxes. I think that's important but often underlooked aspect of what we do, is looking at water and the water use of Australian ecosystems and how that may change into the future. There are really 4 different science applications that we see coming out of the OzFlux network. One is around the accounting aspect. So given that we're able to produce half-hourly to annual estimates using the flux data, we're able to then get sinks and sources of different greenhouse gases for carbon accounting and water management. Disturbance is another theme, using our information to evaluate the effects of disturbance, whether that be pest outbreaks or extreme weather, cyclones, fires, etc. Thirdly, to look at the influence of different land management practices, both in rangelands but also in the agricultural settings, including different agricultural practices and clearing. And lastly, but not least, is being able to produce information for ground truthing, developing, parameterising and validating satellite remote sensing products, ecosystem models and global inversion products. And we've just celebrated 20 years of OzFlux in a recent seminar a couple of weeks ago. At the end of our session today, if you hang around, we'll show a 5-minute video that Caitlin Moore put together on celebrating 20 years of OzFlux. But for OzFlux, generally before the sort of mid-1990s, we had very inconsistent approaches to what we were doing, very short-term campaigns and some large field experiments like the Maritime Continent Thunderstorm Experiment and OASIS, which utilised flux towers, aircraft, boundary layer profiles, remote sensing, trying to link all of those together. And that's where I first got involved in micrometeorology and got my passion for micrometeorology. And these are some images from the McTex project, the Maritime Continent Thunderstorm Experiment. So at this point in time, very much campaign-based measurements, and we certainly didn't have coverage across many ecosystems. In the sort of mid to late 1990s, globally, Euroflux, Meriflux in 1996, and then FLUXNET in 1997. So these global communities were growing. We had started measurements in 1997 at a place called Howard Springs, which is now 19 years old, with Derek, Lindsay, and myself initiating that. And CSIRO got funding for their Tumbarumba site, which is now also 19 years old, which is in a high rainfall, cool temperate zone. And at that point in time, we had, of course, advances in sensing technology, digital data acquisition, and we were able to then think about having longer term deployment. And these images below are from the Howard Springs Flux Tower site, where focus was on savannas, tropical savannas, and fire. And that's a picture of my daughter in 2001 at the Flux Tower, just after we'd installed it. She's now 19. So 2000 to 2010, we are now starting to get some long-term sites in the network. Tumbarumba, Cape Trib, and Howard Springs being the earlier flux towers, but those were really, all of those sites were ad hoc in nature. They were on individual grant projects that were typically, a 3-year grant. You've got enough to establish the tower, maybe get some initial results, but not to keep the towers going. And it was very hard for about 10 years to get that momentum going. It was hard to get funding again for another 3 years to work on the same site. So there was a real tension there in terms of trying to build up the network. Nevertheless, we started OzFlux in 2001 at the inaugural meeting, and Ray Looning was the first director of OzFlux in 2001. And so we began a community, and the community really started to drive and push towards funding. We had lots of funding for attempted funding for grants and national competitive grants, infrastructure grants, which were unsuccessful for about 10 years. And then finally, we lobbied the government enough to develop and put funding from the national research infrastructure funds into supporting a terrestrial ecosystem network across Australia. And so the TERN was launched in 2010, and I'll talk some more about TERN in a few slides' time, but that then enabled us to have the OzFlux network formed, including an injection of capital, and then to keep that going over time. And this is 2010. This is my daughter at the Howard Springs Flux Tower at age 10. And then in the last 10 years, as I said, TERN has come to our aid in some ways to create a network, and we've been since then delivering and trying to build a community. I'll show you that in a few slides' time. And we've learned many lessons along the way, and we're putting together a review paper for global change biology, which will look at the sort of challenges and opportunities and lessons learnt for OzFlux over the last 20 years. So that's in development. And we've had lots of science impact, and I don't have time to go into any of that today, but I'll just refer you to our 20th anniversary conference. All of those presentations are recorded and are available through the OzFlux website if you're interested. So from little things big things grow, we've had a network, obviously, of flux towers and infrastructure. That has then resulted now in 32 active sites across Australia and New Zealand with continuous measurements. We have reliable communications, power supplies that enable us to then get continuous high quality data using standardized sensors and standardized analysis protocols. Then we have developed our own. Peter Isaac has developed a software suite called PyFlux Pro. And all of that information is available in open access data. But it's not just about flux towers, it's also about people that support that. We've got a fantastic central node support staff, Peter Isaac and others that support the whole network. They and researchers are also developing, we have an annual training workshop, training days, which Ray Looning started in the first workshop, and we've continued thereafter. Those annual workshops move from site to site each year. We've had meetings in Methven in New Zealand as well in 2012, and a joint OzFlux Asia Flux workshop in 2018 in Darwin, which was very successful. And all of this is possible due to the researchers and students and the engagement that they have and the passion that they have that we put together this network. So as I said, the OzFlux network now is funded by TERN. So TERN is Australia's ecosystem observatory. It's funded by the national government in the same pool of money that they fund supercomputers and research vessels and synchrotrons and telescopes. So now they fund a research network for the terrestrial biosphere. It's like NEON, except 1,000th less than NEON gets. Nevertheless, we've got three sub-platforms within there. We have what's called the landscapes platform, which is really about remote sensing, sort of continental scale, looking at where and when things happen. So that is continental. Then we have a surveillance platform, which is looking at plots. So those are the small green triangles, which there are many of those. So the many plot-based measurements of vegetation and soils, and those are measured every 5 years, remeasured every 5 years, so we get some idea of long-term changes. And then we have an ecosystem processes platform, which is where OzFlux sits. So we have the OzFlux sites. They're the blue circles on the map, including a bunch in New Zealand that you can see. So about 30 odd sites there. And within there, we have 12 super sites where we have, they're basically intensive ecological observatories looking at ecosystem processes. They're long-term and intensive sites where we do extra ecological measurements. That in total then across the field data collection, aircraft and satellite remote sensing contribute to three themes: one around land and terrain, second around carbon and water, and the third around biodiversity. And all of that is made accessible, and it's designed for use for modelling and other purposes. The ecosystem processes, that's where we are with OzFlux, which provides us with these 30-minute fluxes, as you know, of water, carbon, and greenhouse gases. But in addition to that, at these super sites, we have these seasonal to decadal estimates of biological processes as well. And on the right, you can see a list of all of the other sorts of measurements that we are taking at each of those super sites within the ecosystem processes. So those data are available if people are interested. And I'll just spend a couple of minutes just on the last slide talking about challenges and opportunities for the Australian and New Zealand flux networks. One is around funding. That's never ending. We do have funding from TERN, but it's still almost year-to-year funding and contracts, and there's no guarantee that that's going to continue. We've also got a risk in retaining skills. It's really difficult to retain. We've built up a lot of capacity in skills and people, but retaining those people in such a highly uncertain environment is difficult. Training the next generation is a big one for us. We have the capacity to do it, but we don't have a lot of PhD scholarships, for example, in the Australian system. It's hard to get people to, PhD students to engage in PhDs in this current environment. and it's difficult to get postdocs. The competitive grant pool is decreasing, so our opportunities for creating postdocs and so forth is decreasing. Little LPU is the least publishable unit, which basically is just saying it's a challenge for both ourselves and early career researchers. But 20 years ago, it was possible to have a high quality paper based on 1 year of data from one site. Now we need 10 years of data from a single site or multiple sites. It's becoming much harder for us to publish in the same way. You have to do a whole lot more to get the same publishing value. Maintaining research relevance, so risk, at least for us in terms of the network, is to not fall into the trap of just monitoring for monitoring's sake, but to make sure that we maintain research relevance at each of the sites, and that we basically revisiting that relatively frequently. Something that came out of the OzFlux meeting is the dialogue between satellite and modelling communities, which is always very good, but it always tends to be after the fact. So we were thinking that we probably need a better dialogue between the communities prior to, and planning of activities prior to activities and so forth, so that we're getting the integration right from the start. Timeliness of data is another thing, particularly with new satellite platforms coming up very frequently, and the time limit and the FLUXNet data archives coming every 5 years or so. And so that is not really timely enough for many of the things that we're doing. And so that's an issue for us as well. Opportunities in things like carbon market verification, agricultural management, other things like ecosystem stress, coupling our flux tower measurements with SIF measurements, thermal measurements from satellites to determine ecosystem stress. Trying to work out how we might be able to use our flux towers as sentinels for detecting environmental change. Big data is a challenge and an opportunity for us all. And the last point there is just improved forecasting, and that's both in terms of ecological forecasting, which seems to be a relatively new trend in terms of being able to predict how ecosystems might respond in terms of forecasting, as well as maybe improved weather forecasting by assimilating flux tower information into that. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jason, for giving us that overview of the OzFlux network. So we do have a few minutes for questions. So if you want to answer your questions into Q&A. Okay, one's coming through. Okay, the first question, what's your advice, Jason, for someone who wants to get involved with activities of a regional network? And how can data users, that is someone who's not running a tower, contribute to the regional network?
Well, I think getting involved in the regional networks is really easy. I think that one of the characteristics of the regional networks is that they're very open. All of the regional networks that I've been involved with and seen have a very much an open door policy. We're really focused both on the science, but also on including early career researchers and trying to focus on our students as well. So for our workshops and so forth, we always focus on having student presentations and so forth. So I think just get in touch with your local network and start a conversation, and that conversation can lead to a whole lot of things. In terms of people that not necessarily involved with towers but want to contribute, there are a whole range of things that can be done using the flux tower data, and that's the beauty of the flux networks, is that they're providing a rich database of information that can be mined either through sort of machine learning or data mining techniques or other techniques to look at some of those big data issues, or to include other sorts of data, remote sensing or modelling using the data. There's so many different ways that flux data can be used. So many ways that people can contribute in that way without actually being on the ground.
Great, thank you. We have one more question. So we have some pretty big fires here in California right now. And someone asked, if there's any recent new research initiatives after the large fires that Australia also experienced early this year.
Very good question. I mean, fire is such a pivotal part of our landscape. It's certainly been front and centre of our minds and has been for decades. We've done a lot of work in the tropical savannas on the impact of fire on productivity and trying to look at long-term carbon balance over sort of decades, realising, you need to understand about the frequency and intensity of these events to then be able to look at the long-term net biome exchange. So we need long-term data sets enabled to do that. We did have some other, a flux tower in old growth forest, which was 400-year-old forest in the Eucalyptus regnans, which are 90-metre tall trees. They're as big as the Californian redwoods. And in 2009, we had a fire go through that site, and that site was destroyed. But we did manage to monitor. We went straight back in and started monitoring again after the fire. So we were then able to, once in a multi-generation opportunity to get in and have a look at what happens after the fire. How does this system respond? What happens to the water use? How much water then flows off into the dams? And so there are opportunities to look at fire. And Tumbarumba was burnt in the last fire. That was our 19-year-old site at Tumbarumba. That was burnt in the last fire. So we'll have an opportunity there to go in and look at the effect of the fire there as well. So we do have these ad hoc opportunities that happen.
Great, thank you. Okay, and one more quick question. How many of the OzFlux sites receive funding from the central program from TURN versus how many are kind of volunteer sites that contribute data but get funding elsewhere?
Yeah, good question. Most of the sites so some PIs like myself have a small amount of money to run a super site, but we actually funnel some of that money to support other sites. So for me, typically I've got 3 other sites that I use to support and to use those funds to enable me to have three flux towers, for example. So some of the money does sort of flow indirectly to support those other towers, but there are certainly some that are not supported directly, and probably on the order of 5 of those flux towers wouldn't receive any direct support. Most of them are from individual grants that PIs have got to operate those towers.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason, for your great presentation. We'll move on to our next speaker now. If you could stop sharing your screen. If I could ask our next speaker to share their screen. So our next speaker is David Campbell. Dave is an associate professor of earth sciences at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. As a member of the Waikato Biogeochemistry and Ecohydrology group, Dave studies the carbon balance of New Zealand's distinctive peatland and agricultural ecosystems. He was an early adopter of micrometeorology for measuring both carbon dioxide as well as methane exchanges. And he is also the lead investigator at the only Southern Hemisphere bog site compiled as part of the recent FLUXNET methane synthesis. The title of Dave's talk is The Kiwi EC Connection from Peat to Pasture. So take it away. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Everyone, can you hear me, Gavin?
Yes, we hear you.
Yep.
We hear you.
And am I sharing my presentation screen?
Looks good.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Hey, everybody.
Not full screen yet, Dave.
It's not full screen?
No.
Okay, I'm on the wrong screen then. It's a problem with having 2 screens. Is that better, Jason?
No.
Okay.
You could either unshare and then share the other screen.
Okay. All right. It's a bit hard to work out which one it is. That one. Have I got it now, Jason?
Yes.
Cool. You'd think, having done this a few times this year, I'd get it right finally. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, Jason, for giving that history of the OzFlux network. I guess, yeah, the approach I'm going to take is a little bit different. It's a little bit more about my personal journey of discovery in my academic career. And I just want to talk a little bit about that. Our research careers are a little bit like an adventure. In other words, they're a journey with a very uncertain outcome, which can be exciting, but it can be pretty frustrating. So opportunities, successes, failures, and our colleagues and friends all influence that pathway and the final destination. And like anyone in the Flux community, I've certainly had my share of failures, but ultimately they've helped inform success along the way. And now I'm having the problem where, oh, here we go. So just stepping right back to the 80s, a little bit of my motivation really as a PhD student. I was really interested in vegetation hydrology, which we'd now call eco-hydrology. And the question at the time really was with wide-scale planting of some of our indigenous tussock grasslands with introduced pine forest, there was a real concern around water yield and other uses of water from these catchments. And it was really difficult to figure out what the original vegetation was doing. So I was primarily interested in how will the water yield of these catchments changed. And so we constructed a large weighing lysimeter, which is really heavy science, but lysimeters have a really play an important part of our history because they were one of the ways that we could actually get direct measurements of evaporation and transpiration from living ecosystems, or at least small parts of them. But in the 1980s, some of the challenges were that running these instrument systems off grid was pretty difficult, and handling big data sets. And it's a bit of a joke, big, because we're talking about a couple of years of hourly data. But there was just very little in the way of software to be able to deal with it. So we've certainly come a long way from then. When I moved to the north of New Zealand and started my academic career in the early 90s, I guess I was looking for somewhere to anchor my academic interests, and the mountains and indigenous ecosystems seemed quite a long way away from a lot of the developed farmland in the part of New Zealand I live in now. But an ecologist colleague of mine pointed me in the direction of this ecosystem, which is the Kapurtai peat bog, which is a large peat forming wetland, 100 square kilometres in size, largely intact, and a complete wilderness surrounded by fairly developed agricultural land. At the time, I knew nothing about wetlands and nothing about peat. But globally, peatlands for over 10,000 years have been an enormous sink for atmospheric carbon dioxide. And as long as they're left undisturbed, they're a very large reservoir of that carbon. And as soon as they are drained for agriculture or forestry or plantations in the tropics, that CO2 then starts getting released back to the atmosphere at a very rapid rate. So the way we manage these peatlands and destroy them by drainage is a very large threat. And the same is true in our part of the world. Most of our large peatland ecosystems have now been drained, and much of it's used for dairy production, so grazing for dairy cows. But there's a bit of a puzzle about these large peatland systems in New Zealand, because they really shouldn't be here at all. If one looks at this figure, which shows the climate space, so mean annual temperature on the x-axis and mean annual precipitation on the y, the grey squares represent the land north of 45 degrees north. So this is Northern Hemisphere. And all the black points here show grid cells that have got peatlands occurring in them. And you see mostly peatlands occur sort of in the mean annual temperature range, -15 up to about 5 degrees Celsius. By comparison, the peatlands that we have here in New Zealand are real outliers. It's far too warm. We get quite severe seasonal water deficits, and these peatlands to function as carbon sinks, they really need to stay wet year round. So there's a bit of a mystery, and I think we're still some way away from sort of solving that one. But as a hydrologist, I sort of walked out into this place and I thought, what on earth can I do out here? You know, there's no, it's not the traditional catchment. There's no identifiable surface runoffs of water. You can't build a weir and measure those things. So fortunately, I had a little bit of experience with micrometeorology, and so our first few campaigns, we were using the Campbell scientific Bowen ratio systems, which were quite popular in the early 90s, and we set these up within this bog and another bog. And the questions that we were trying to answer really focused around what the controls on water vapor fluxes were in this water-rich ecosystem. And we found some pretty startling findings, really. The literature at the time in the mid-90s really stressed that most wetland environments had pretty high evaporation rates. So the graph on the left shows calculated Penman open water evaporation, which was often used as a bit of an index for wetland studies. And on the y-axis, we've got our daily measured evaporation total. The dashed lines here represent a couple of Northern Hemisphere examples, so that actual evaporation was generally a pretty high proportion of the calculated Penman open water evaporation, except our ecosystem was a real anomaly. We're looking at rates about a third of open water evaporation. And when we look at the energy balance, the diagram on the right, things get even weirder. So in a water-rich ecosystem or a well-watered agricultural site, we'd expect the latent heat flux to consume most of the net radiation, maybe 80% of it or so, if water's not limiting. In these bog environments, the latent heat flux is incredibly low. It doesn't get that much greater than about 100 watts per square meter. The dots here are Bowen ratios, and you can see in the middle part of the day, Bowen ratios between 4 and 5. Now, this is crazy stuff. These sorts of environments with Bowen ratios these high are generally semi-arid or desert environments. So we've coined this phrase, the wet desert, for these peatland ecosystems. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But in 1997, I was really fortunate to have a sabbatical in Canada, and I noticed that Andy Black and Zoran Nesic are online. So hey guys, I just wanted to shout out a big thanks. So I arrived there at a time that they were rebuilding some of the eddy covariance sites, so I got to work on some of these. And I guess I discovered how difficult making these long-term measurements were. But these guys were real pioneers of our discipline these days. I also got to visit Merbleur Bog in Ontario with Peter Lafleur, and that's one of our longest running wetland sites. It's been running now since 1998. And I was lucky enough to revisit Merbleur back in 2012, and that site's being managed by Alan Humphreys from Carleton University, and this is Matt Brown on the left. So really nice to go and visit the site after so many publications and fantastic science that's come out of it. So I guess I got scared off ever attempting to build a closed path eddy covariance system, and then came back to New Zealand, and what did I do? Myself and a PhD student built a closed path eddy covariance system, and we put it in a site where there was no hope of getting mains power to it, so it was completely off-grid. So that had quite a lot of challenges as well. So our first measurements were within a remnant peatland ecosystem. And I guess one of the outcomes of that is that as a consequence of New Zealand's sort of mid-latitude position and very temperate, warm temperate climate, these peatland ecosystems are sustained by year-round growing conditions. So maybe only 1 or 2 months of the year, we actually end up with the ecosystems as the net source of CO2. But across the fence, of course, we're dealing with peatlands that are being drained for agriculture, some of them for around 100 years, and some of them for only 30 or 40 years. And much of New Zealand's pastoral agriculture is based around dairy farming, and there's lots of questions there about greenhouse gas emissions and soil carbon, or the stability of the soil carbon stock. So my colleagues and I decided we'd take a punt at starting to do some agricultural eddy covariance work. And so we moved our closed path system into this farming environment. And we also built a mobile eddy covariance tower that we could shift between farms within a couple of hours or so. I guess the first discovery was that it's actually really hard to do this sort of science in intensively grazed agricultural systems. And that's because we've got cows wandering around, and cows are eating biomass in one place, and they are depositing excrement and then going somewhere else and depositing excrement there. And in the process, they're completely decimating the photosynthetic biomass within our paddocks. And so we get light response curves like this, where there's a huge amount of variation at particular light levels. And now here we can see the effect of pre-grazing, where there's lots of grass in the paddock, and then immediately post-grazing when there's not that much. We realized that we were going to have to take a whole ecosystem carbon balance approach, and refining this approach has really been something that we've spent a huge amount of time on over the last decade or so, simply because of the complications of the farmed environment. And when we talk about intensive agriculture in New Zealand, we're talking about year-round rotational grazing. In the morning, after milking, the cows can come in a paddock, and there might be 300 of them in an area of 2 to 3 hectares. And over a couple of hours, they'll remove just about all of the photosynthesizing biomass there. So that causes a real problem. If you can imagine from an eddy covariance perspective, where we might establish an EC tower, and then of course, depending on the direction of the wind and atmospheric conditions, we'll get a footprint which tells us, you know, the likely spatial distribution of where our fluxes are coming from. But in these sort of artificially constrained paddocks, that sets up a huge complication. Depending on where the wind's coming from, you might either have very little photosynthesizing biomass or quite a lot. And so that creates a huge amount of noise within the light response curve, which becomes a real problem when we try to gap fill our data sets, when we sort of try to model net ecosystem exchange. And so I kind of scratched my head and I thought, well, is this noise or is it information? Surely it's information that we can use. And so I stumbled across a technique that had been used by Finnish researchers, and they had developed this phytomass index, which was an index derived from our net ecosystem exchange measurements. And basically a low phytomass index is correlated with a low amount of growing pasture or crops. And when we subdivided our data set or partitioned it by the phytomass index, lo and behold, we found that we're not dealing with noise, we're dealing with information. And so instead of a really noisy model fit, we could actually use that phytomass information to advantage and get much, much better gap filling models going. However, I've always retained that fascination with ecosystem function in a much more natural space. And so from 2011, colleagues and students we established an eddy covariance site at Kapurtai Bog, and so that's at this little wee smudge down here. It's a 2-kilometre walk from where we can get the vehicle, and it's still running nearly 9 years later. And over that time, we've found out some really interesting things about this ecosystem. And again, we've applied the net ecosystem carbon balance approach. But in the case of a peatland, it's much, much simpler than in these agricultural situations. So what's so unusual about this ecosystem? Well, in the Northern Hemisphere, these peatlands are dominated by mosses. So most of the peat organic material is accumulated over thousands of years by mosses, whereas in New Zealand, it's vascular plants that do that. And it's a bit of a strange ecosystem, and got to be careful around Jason, because this is essentially an Australian flora which has got transplanted in New Zealand many thousands of years ago and turned into an amazing carbon sink. It's such a weird ecosystem that the roots of the main peat former actually grow above ground. These are called cluster roots. And another really strange property of this system is that there's a huge amount of standing biomass. So within the lower canopy, there's a very large fraction of the biomass, which is this long-lived dead material. And we think that this functions as effectively as a mulch, preventing water vapor diffusing from the moist peat surface up into the boundary layer. And so that's sort of a physical barrier to water vapor loss, as well as that the plants have got very low transpiration rates. So just sort of a snapshot of some of our net ecosystem exchange and NECB work. I guess some highlights here is that in years with droughts, and we've had a whole sequence of, well, for New Zealand anyway, quite severe droughts. And this ecosystem barely notices it. The blue points here on the top graph, which is GPP, on the lower graph is ecosystem respiration. 2012 was a wet summer, whereas the other 3 years we had droughts or very dry summers in the early months of the year. And really the only thing that we can notice going on here is that in the dry years, ecosystem respiration was a little bit greater because the water table was a little bit deeper. In the extreme drought year of 2013, which was estimated to be the most extreme drought in New Zealand in the last 80 years, we still had a really strong sink for CO2 or for carbon in that year, which is different than other researchers have found for the Northern Hemisphere. Compared to Northern Hemisphere analogous ecosystems, there's quite a large methane flux from the bog. And again, we put that down to a year-round growing conditions so that methane can evolve out of the peat year-round, and it's relatively warm. During wet years, which is in the graph, it's the blue diamonds here. So it's this wet year, 2012. The methane flux just followed a fairly simple seasonal pattern, lower in winter and higher in summer when it was warmer. For all the other 3 years where the water table was a bit deeper in various drought conditions, the methane flux crashed early on in summer and then took a long time to recover. And this is something that people had looked at in lab experiments and mesocolumns, but this was really the first time that it was demonstrated on an ecosystem scale. It's a really hysteretic response of methane fluxes to the water table. As the water table decreases in summer, then the methane flux crashes, then the water table recovers, but the methane flux takes many, many months to recover again, and then eventually completes this sort of triangular hysteretic curve. A few weeks ago at the OzFlux meeting, Dennis Baldocchi gave a keynote paper, and he made the point that we often overlook our long data sets of water vapor fluxes, and we should really spend some time looking at those. And that's where I got started, and I've always meant to go back to it. And so I guess my question is, are these crazily low evaporation rates that we measure out in these bog systems the key ecosystem engineering trait of these bogs, which are forming in warm temperate environments? So these are just monthly averages over a 4-year period of monthly evaporation totals at Kapurtai Bog, here in red, and in blue, a pasture site on a farm which is about 30 or 40 kilometers away. And we can see that there's a huge difference in monthly evaporation rates in the summer and spring periods, which adds up to quite a big difference in evaporation rates over an annual period. And I've already talked about the crazy energy balances, which are shown on the right. So finally, just getting back to agriculture, and this is the pasture part of the title, really. New Zealand has a big challenge with our greenhouse gas emissions compared to other developed countries, because agriculture makes up almost 50% of our greenhouse gas inventory. And of that, most of it comes from methane from ruminant cows and sheep, and quite a lot of nitrous oxide emissions from the soils, which are subject to a lot of nitrogen emissions. And up until recent years, of course, it's been very difficult to measure nitrous oxide and methane with anything other than chambers. And so sort of traditional approaches in agricultural science is to use chamber approaches. A few years ago, we took a punt on that it was probably time that we tried to build a closed path eddy covariance system with using a quantum cascade laser. So this is an aerodyne quantum cascade laser here. And we've built 2 of these systems. This is our first one here. Got the cows grazing around. They're depositing urine and dung, which are powerful sources of nitrous oxide once it gets into the soil. And the cool thing with being able to make continuous measurements of nitrous oxide fluxes is that you can start to get to some of the biophysical drivers of fluxes that you just can't do with intermittent chamber type experiments. So this graph shows the relationship between the nitrous oxide flux and the soil water-filled pore space. And it's kind of interesting that it fits with some of the theoretical models of the nitrogen transformations and pathways in the soil dependent on the water-filled pore space that result in gases, including nitrous oxide, being emitted. Some of our recent work has got back into these drained peatland ecosystems. And this has been a project called Peatwise, which is a collaboration with European scientists and those of us down here in New Zealand. And it's been an opportunity to get to grips with what's going on in these agricultural peatland settings in a little bit more detail. Probably one of the biggest surprises is that in a year with quite a dry summer, we find a huge amount of spatial variation between the 2 sites we set up, shown here, and the net ecosystem production, or the net ecosystem exchange of CO2. One site was pretty much neutral and the other site lost around 5 tons of carbon per hectare. And when we compile a full net ecosystem carbon balance, we see that huge difference between the sites. And that seems to have a lot to do with subsurface moisture supply, keeping respiration going at one of the sites and constraining it at the other. So that's where I'm going to leave it. And I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues, both in New Zealand and overseas, that I've had the pleasure to work with, our funders, landowners, people that let us onto the land, and of course, many, many fantastic grad students.
Thank you very much, David. Really great to see some methane and nitrous oxide in the mix there. I think we should probably hold the questions that we've received until the end. And I'll ask you if you can stop sharing your screen. We'll switch over to our last presenter. So our final speaker today is Caitlin Moore. Caitlin is a research fellow at the School of Agriculture and Environment and is also based at the University of Western Australia, as is Jason. Caitlin received her PhD at Monash University studying tropical savanna productivity using a combination of eddy covariance and phenocam data. She then completed a postdoctoral position studying bioenergy crops at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Currently, she's bringing together new measurements and modeling techniques to better predict crop and native ecosystem stress in Western Australia. Caitlin serves as External Communications Officer on OzFlux's steering committee, and the title of her talk today is An Early Career Researcher Perspective on OzFlux. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thanks, Gavin, and hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in to hear about our wonderful OzFlux group today. A big thanks to the FLUXNET-ECN network for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all about my experience as an ECR within OzFlux, but also the AmeriFlux group and the wider FLUXNet community. I'll talk today about my experience as an ECR so far, some lessons I've learned along the way, and provide some advice to other ECR folks who might be listening. Can everyone hear me okay, by the way? Because I can see Gavin still in my image. Great, cool. And so first off, I'm bringing you this talk today from Perth in Western Australia. And as such, I would like to acknowledge the traditional landowners on which the University of Western Australia is located, who are the Noongar people. And so my first introduction to OzFlux was during my honours and master's research year. My project was to investigate the tree water use of Wombat Forest in central Victoria, pictured here, using the sap flow technique. This turned out to be a bit of a disaster, mainly due to instrument issues. And so I only ended up with about 23 days of data to use from what I hoped would be 9 months or so. Luckily for me, there was a flux tower that had just been installed in Wombat Forest, which actually turned 10 this year, by the way. So I could use the ET data from it to tell a more complete story of forest water use. So despite the kind of initial failure of my project, I learned a lot in the process, and particularly that conferences are really fun. So this was my first OzFlux conference in Methven in 2012. I met a whole bunch of the OzFlux greats, as well as some fellow students like myself. Our research group at the end also tacked on a ski trip to the nearby slopes, which was also super fun. And it was here that Jason asked me if I'd like to do a PhD. And I decided I would, but not using SapFlow again. So instead, I switched over to look at carbon and compare the tree and grass productivity dynamics in a tropical savanna in Australia. So with a superstar savanna supervising team, I headed to the tropics in the historic Howard Springs OzFlux site, which we've heard a little bit about today. Then I soon learned why very few people had looked at quantifying grass productivity dynamics in savannas till I came along, because it was so hot during my first wet season field campaign that after drinking almost 10 litres of water on my first wet season field day, and I nearly sweated most of it out, I almost quit on the spot. Luckily, Jason didn't answer his phone when I rang to quit, so that gave me more time to reconsider, and I actually decided to stick with the PhD. And so for my PhD work, we installed an understory flux tower at Howard Springs, so I could really tease apart the overstory and understory fluxes to look at the tree and grass productivity dynamics together. And what we found was that the grasses accounted for about 1/3 of savanna annual productivity, which had a really strong seasonal component. With the addition of phenocams, we looked at the links between vegetation greenness and indices and productivity, and we found a pretty nice relationship, particularly between the grasses shown over here in the green. And so then with the assistance of some additional expertise, Randall and John Francois, we were able to model tree and grass GPP dynamics over a much longer period to start looking at seasonal, interannual and decadal drivers of tree and grass productivity. And what we really found was that the tree and grass productivity dynamics were driven by light limitation in the wet season and water limitation in the dry season. And so I already knew conferences were fun, but during my PhD, I learned that workshops were even better. And so each year, the OzFlux community puts on a data processing workshop where folks can get together and learn how to process flux data, teach others how to do it, and have a great old time in the process. We often got to interact with industry partners at these workshops too, such as from Lycor and Campbell Scientific. And we usually collected the pearls of wisdom, as Jamie cleverly very aptly calls them, from Peter Isaac as well. And in my final year of my PhD, I actually attended the Flux course in Boulder. Like with the OzFlux workshop, I was able to meet with and learn from some of the superstars of the flux community. And I came across this picture here from Kim Novik's recent paper about the AmeriFlux community and recognized the student in the picture with the orange shorts as myself. And so I had to include it here today. Great paper, by the way, Kim, if you're listening. A coalition of the willing indeed. And so flux course was pretty important for me near the final stages of my PhD, as it was the source of my postdoc employment. And so Carl Bernacki at the University of Illinois, who was a flux course instructor, was hiring a postdoc to work on a newly funded project called water efficient sorghum technologies. So I made the big move to the USA right after handing in my PhD thesis and getting married to my long-term partner. I was keen to gain some agricultural experience, and so moving to Illinois was a perfect opportunity for this. And after working in the Australian savannas looking at native sorghum, I thought I'd have a pretty good understanding of systems grown in the US. Oof, how wrong I was. The supersized American bioenergy sorghum was certainly a beast to behold. So when I started at Illinois, Carl was running 5 flux towers and had plans to install several more. When he learned of the full breadth of my experience from OzFlux and that I enjoyed working with flux towers, I joined the newly funded Centre for Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation at UIUC. And so using my skills in flux data processing that I attained from all the OzFlux workshops that I'd attended, I was able to standardize and update the processing of more than 40 site years of data from Illinois using the PyFlux Pro tool developed by the OzFlux community. With support from Peter Isaac and Cecilia Ewens to help get me started. And so we're now able to look at some of the interannual productivity dynamics across 4 major bioenergy crop candidates grown in the Midwest, which is a paper I'm currently working on finishing. With the help of our research technician, Evan Dracup, we were actually able to get all 4 of these sites registered as AmeriFlux sites. And so our data are currently undergoing internal checks within AmeriFlux, but should be available soon. So a nice plug for your sites, Carl, if you're listening. Coming from an open data sharing group like OzFlux made me really comfortable with sharing the Illinois data that I was working with. And as Carl has typically left this decision up to postdocs running his towers in the past. And so some other flux stories that came from my work at Illinois included reverting a mature perennial switchgrass cropping system back to an annual maize rotation to look at the carbon and nitrogen cycle impacts of doing so. We ripped up the switchgrass field using a moldboard plough and planted corn, with a flux tower in the centre of the field to record the changes. And not too surprisingly, our towers showed much greater carbon loss from the reverted field compared to the controlled sites, and the converted field is shown here in the green. And so with the combined efforts from the Delucia lab and the Yang labs, we also measured below ground changes in carbon and nitrogen, pools and fluxes, which we then used with help from the Hudeberg and Parton labs to model future biogeochemical impacts using the DayCent model. And so there were too many faces to include as collaborators on this particular slide, but our paper was recently accepted in Global Change Biology Bioenergy. And so it's going through the final stages of proof and will be available soon. So you can check it out if you're interested. And so I mentioned earlier that Carl wanted to install more flux towers, and one of them went into a sorghum field so we could compare how sorghum stacks up against rival bioenergy crops, maize and miscanthus. And this was really my first opportunity to build a flux tower from scratch, and I soon discovered that a heck of a lot of work goes into it. Our new tower has worked pretty well though, and it's providing us with a useful first look at how sorghum compares at the ecosystem scale to maize and miscanthus. And in the Midwest, it just grows and grows and grows. It produces a huge amount of biomass. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this compares at the ecosystem scale long term. I also traveled south to Florida to install a new flux tower in grazed pasture that we soon after converted to sugarcane. And so this tower has been running for about a year now, collecting pretty good data so far, and is now managed by the very capable Nuria Gomez Casanovas at UIUC, as I am no longer there. And so a major lesson I then learned from my postdoc is to really build your network. While EC fluxes were my focus in Illinois, I collaborated on a bunch of different projects with a bunch of amazing people. I built the chamber shown in the figures on the bottom of the screen here to collect canopy scale photosynthesis measurements that we then paired with a sun-induced chlorophyll fluorescence system I built up in the top right-hand corner. And so broadening my skills in this way and learning new tricks led me back home to Australia, where I'm now back working with Jason, as well as some new faces for me, including Richard Silverstein from Edith Cowan University and Suzanne Prober from CSIRO and their teams, on a project that's funded by the Australian Tern Network and the WA state government. And our aim here is to detect vegetation stress in 4 key ecosystems pictured here in Australia, in Western Australia, using hyperspectral sensors such as SIF. And so my new Illinois skills are coming in really handy. And so that's a brief summary of how I got to where I am as a research fellow at UWA. And I thought I'd now share my top 10 opportunities that I gained from OzFlux along my ECR journey. First off, OzFlux gave me a large support network beyond that of my very capable PhD committee. I made friends with fellow students, ECRs, PIs, and industry folk through being part of OzFlux. I also gained really good practical field experience, as well as improved my data management skills. The networking opportunities that arose at conferences and workshops helped me learn things and make friends along the way. And being part of OzFlux also opened up links to other networks, such as Tern in Australia, but also the Flux networks, such as AmeriFlux, AsiaFlux, and the wider FLUXNet community for me in particular. I developed and improved my technical skills at each OzFlux training workshop I went to, but I also got to meet with and learn from folks at Lycor and Campbell Scientific as well, which has been hugely valuable for me. And after a few years, I actually began to teach others at the OzFlux workshop how to do things that I'd previously learned, which was super valuable mentoring experience for me as an early career researcher. OzFlux also opened up more opportunities for me to collaborate on different projects, which often led to my inclusion on publications that were in addition to those that I got from my PhD. This is also true for the openness of the OzFlux community in sharing data, which has led to my inclusion on publications both from OzFlux and now from my work at Illinois in sharing our data. And so I also recently became part of the OzFlux steering committee, as mentioned earlier, taking on the role of external communications. As a science communications and outreach are becoming more important for us researchers every day, this experience has been incredibly valuable for me as an ECR. And probably most important to me, and something that I've already mentioned a few times now, is my cohort of friends around the world that being part of OzFlux, AmeriFlux, and the wider FLUXNet community has contributed to. But I'm also not the only one who thinks this about the OzFlux community. I asked a few of the other current students and postdocs in OzFlux to share their experiences of the community, and their sentiments are very similar to my own. For example, Atbin Mahabadi says he likes the OzFlux network because it's more like a family to him, with quite kind and supportive members who are more than happy to share their information and knowledge. Likewise, Alison Bennett at the University of Melbourne says the OzFlux community has been incredibly inclusive, helpful, and responsive to her during her PhD. And last but not least, Dr. Anne Griebel, a research fellow at the University of Western Sydney, and one of my close friends who I actually met through OzFlux, has said having such dedicated personal support available to her through OzFlux has been invaluable for development of her theoretical knowledge base, her practical skill set, and for establishing collaborations with external research groups within the network. And I couldn't agree more with Anne on these sentiments. And so I'll conclude now with some pieces of advice that I have for the ECR community, bearing in mind that I'm still an ECR myself and haven't quite made it to the big time yet. So number one, I'd say actively participate in your regional network, at least, so that people know who you are and you get to know people. Make use of the wealth of knowledge available in the Flux networks. We've seen a little more of this lately with some of the interesting and quite informative questions that have been asked on the FLUXNet email list. And so it's really good to see that and use that information as an early career researcher. Attend workshops if you can, because I've found these to be more useful for meeting with and talking to the busy PIs in the Flux community than conferences tend to be. Seek out a mentor in your network if you can. I've definitely pestered a bunch of people in all the different networks for science advice in the past. And so a big shout out and a big thanks to all of you who have given me bits of advice along my way. Keep expanding your skill sets and trying new things, whether that's working at different sites or trying some modeling or a new technique. Don't be afraid also to share your data. As I've mentioned before, this has led to my inclusion on several papers that I wouldn't otherwise have had been included on, and it's important for us as early career researchers to get those publications. Number 7, I'd say give back to your community as well by mentoring new researchers and yourself. It can be tough to gain teaching experience as an ECR, which I found in the US at times because of visa issues related to my postdoc. But there are ways you can get it by helping others learn. And plus, it's a nice thing to do to give back to your community. And last but not least, keep having fun at what you're doing, because some days can be tough, of course, and this year in particular has shown us this. But I'm a firm believer that we get the best results from our work if we have fun doing it. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you all for listening, and a big thanks to all of those of you who have helped me along my ECR journey so far. And I can take questions now.
Great. Thank you very much, Caitlin. That was a really great presentation. So we are a little after the hour mark, and now that our formal presentation has ended, I wanted to take a moment just to say thank you very much to Jason, Dave, and Caitlin for getting up early and presenting for us today. And thank you also for everyone who joined us. And so I'm now going to invite people to stay on for a few minutes. I think we have some questions that we didn't get to, both for Dave's talk and also for Caitlin's talk. So I'll let those come through now. Let's see. So one question that came through for Dave's talk was someone asked, as a grad student starting a PhD, what would you recommend as a thesis theme for someone interested in peatland research?
Okay, I mean, peatlands globally have got all sorts of challenges, still being drained for agriculture, but a changing climate, of course, as we know, can change the balances between sink and source of fluxes. And for peatlands to sort of maintain that global cooling effect that they've had for thousands of years, it's really the ratio of CO2 uptake to methane emission. And so trying to get a handle on how that ratio might change over time is pretty important, and that'll depend on the type of peatland and different sorts of biomes. And restoration of peatlands is really, really quite challenging, but something that we're going to have to do. And again, when we re-wet a peatland, you go from losing a lot of CO2 to potentially taking up again, but initially they could become quite severe methane sources, and there's a lot of discussion and literature around that. So I think those are some of the topical questions that are out there.
Great, thank you. And we have a question for Caitlin. So I think someone noticed your agricultural focus and asked, over agricultural fields, which are highly managed, things like harvest and application of fertilizers are important to those systems. And so how do you manage and include these management effects in your data analysis? And what sort of ancillary information do you have to collect for that?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and teasing apart the climate versus land management aspects of these highly managed systems can be challenging. As Dave kind of alluded to earlier with his presentation looking at pasture sites, we use the EC systems to give us the overall net ecosystem exchange, but then we do take harvest into account and calculate what we call a net ecosystem carbon balance to sort of get at what are the sort of the pools and fluxes in these systems. It's not an easy thing to do necessarily to account for absolutely every single piece of carbon and methane flux lost from these systems. Thankfully for us in the Midwest, there's not a lot of methane lost, but there can be a lot of nitrous oxide. And so we've just installed aerodyne systems like Dave has been running in New Zealand to capture the sort of Eddy covariance time scale, nitrous oxide fluxes in particular at these sites. And so, yeah, it's certainly a challenge, but with these new measurement techniques, we're hopefully going to be able to figure it out a little bit easier.
Great. So there was one more question that came in earlier, so it probably was directed to Jason, but I think any of you could chime in on this, which is what is the overall trend and overall NEE of Australia?
That's a very open-ended question and somewhat difficult to answer. I think in terms of the overall average NEE, for Australia, it's, if you look at our 2016 paper, is 1.8 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. That's an average across all the sites. So it's not a spatial average. So you've got to, so getting the spatial average even of NEE is difficult, and you can do that using machine learning, neural networks and so forth to try and get a sort of spatially weighted average across the country. But that just gives you net ecosystem exposure at a single point in time. If you're looking at changes in NEE over time, that becomes very difficult, and it varies from place to place. And there's really only, I've had a look at all of the long-term data from all of our sites, and there are only 2 flux towers that show a significant trend. And Dennis has given a great plot in one of his papers looking at our ability to be able to detect these sorts of trends in NEE over time, given the length of time of the record, the magnitude of the fluxes and the uncertainty around those fluxes. And so you really need to be in a sweet spot of those to be able to expect to be able to detect those changes. And we're not at a point in Australia where we have enough data to be able to do that using our flux towers. So then we can get it other ways, other sorts of data assimilation. There's a project called RECAP, which was run by the Global Carbon Project. They did a decadal data assimilation using the flux tower data and a whole bunch of other data that was assimilated to get the best estimate of continental NEP. And then they looked at how that has changed over the last 10 years, over a 10-year period. So that was the period of the RECAP project. And now they're just redoing that for the current up to 2020. So you can get it that way.
Any other thoughts on that question? Okay, yeah, so the last question we have is also quite a broad one, and so I think anyone can jump in. And the question is, how can the Flux community integrate better with the remote sensing community? So I guess thinking about that from a OzFlux perspective.
I'm happy to jump in if you guys. So I think it was something that I pointed to at the end of my talk was around the integration with the remote sensing and modelling communities more broadly. And I think that it's partly just due to the nature of science. A lot of the remote sensing and modelling projects, what they're after at the end of the day is just a comparison with the truth. So they grab the flux tower data and use that to validate their remote sensing or ecosystem models. And so that's a good point for an opportunity to work with the remote sensing community. But I think that's too much after the fact. I think we have an opportunity to perhaps plan some joint projects between the remote sensing and the micromet communities to try and build specific projects or activities, programs where we sit down right at the start, a priori, to design a suite of experiments or analyses that involve both the eddy covariance and the remote sensing communities rather than as sort of an afterthought.
Any other thoughts? Okay, so I think that covers all the questions we received. So I just wanted to thank you all again one more time for joining us and for your great presentations. It was really interesting to learn about OzFlux today.
You're very welcome. And if people want to hang around afterwards, I'll share my screen and play the 5-minute OzFlux celebration video that Caitlin put together.
That's right. We do have a video that we can play now. Yeah, so if you want to do that, go ahead, Jason.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you guys this morning. Hang on.